Dave Klug is my guest today. He's a fantasy football analyst at footballguys.com. Go there and check out all the stuff they've got. It's a pretty cheap membership for all the bits and goodies that they give you to get you ready for your football league. Today we did a little bit of rookie for the vet. We compared ADPs of some different position players, talked about maybe what's next in the fantasy football world, and all kind of things throughout the fantasy football landscape. It's always great to talk with Dave. If you enjoyed today's podcast, make sure you like and subscribe and follow the Big Douglas Show. Leave us a comment. We always like getting feedback and seeing what you think. So without any further ado, here's my conversation with Dave Klug. All right, Dave, a repeat offender. We always feel good when we can get somebody on for the second time. And so we're fortunate to have you. How have you been?
I've been doing great, man, and I will come on this show anytime you invite me on, Doug. I always love talking football with you. Last time we got to talk a little bit of Commanders and a little. Well, I think they were still the Washington football team last time we did the show. Now the
They
Commanders,
were
formerly known as the Washington football team, got to talk about them a little bit and the Bears a little bit. So excited to chop it up again this year.
no doubt. Today's every day I put at least one Twitter question out there. Today's is, were you alive the last time your favorite team won a championship?
Not my favorite football team. I'm a Chicago kid, born in 1990, so I was born a few years after that 85 Super Bowl, but I've been alive for 6 Bulls championships, 3 Stanley Cups. I actually lived in Wrigleyville when the Cubs won the World Series. Oh my goodness. It sounds fun in theory, but I can assure you it was a miserable year. And then also, I'm a White Sox fan though, so got to see them win as well. So I've seen a lot of championships, but have never seen a Super Bowl. And as much as I love other sports, I would trade every one of those Chicago championships for a Bears Super Bowl.
It's so funny. I hear that all the time when that sort of questions is asked. Is like, I'd give them all up for the Super Bowl. And
Mhm.
that 85 now, that's one of the first Super Bowls my grays are coming through. That 85 was one of the first Super Bowls I really remember being. I wasn't old, but I was old enough to watch it, and stay up for it in the fridge and all those guys. I think that was one of my, other than the Redskins Super Bowls, I think that was one of my favorite Super Bowls, non-Redskins related. Just a fun team to root for.
So, funny story, real quickly, since we're talking
Please.
about that Super Bowl. I say funny story, and then I'm going to talk about how my grandpa just passed. But he had a sense of humor. He'd have been able to laugh at it. But my grandpa just passed a few months ago. Went back to Chicago for the wedding and or for the funeral. I'm sorry, and he's in his casket and he's wearing a Bears jersey backwards, a jersey that I had never seen before. I consider myself pretty good when it comes to football, and it said Watker, Waechter, and I had never heard of this guy before. So I'm looking it up and I'm like, Watker. So I find out that there's this guy, Henry Watker, and he was the third string defensive lineman on the Bears when they won their Super Bowl. And I said, of all of the jerseys in the world, why in the heck would he wear this? So I'm sitting there, a few hours go by in the funeral. I have no idea why. And then one of his buddies comes in and starts laughing hysterically at the casket. And I go, what's so funny? And he goes, he got buried in the Watker jersey. He said that night they were out at a bar. He put $100 down on a square. Henry Watker was the third string defensive lineman that came in the fourth quarter and hit the safety in the fourth quarter. So my grandpa won $2,000 on the square and got buried in his jersey because of it.
It's the little thing about sports that it's why we do it, right?
Yep.
I mean, those are the moments. Incredible. Let's see. I was stalking your timeline for today's show. Something you put up recently was the No Skips Allowed album. I
Mhm.
love this. I have two. I think I could have come up with more than two. I have the original Fugees album, the score. I think you
Yeah.
can put on and just listen from beginning to end. I think Confrontation from Bob Marley and the Wailers is a turn on and let it go till the end. And I was thinking maybe the very first Outcast album was a
Which one
put
is
it
that?
on. That is the
ATLians?
Southern playlistic Cadillac Muzak all
All
ran
right.
together.
Yeah.
I,
So I'm
I think I think that one counts.
So I'm a big Stankonia fan. I've actually got a
Okay.
record collection. I've got a few hundred records. We actually have an entire room that's like dedicated to my record collection with just, we got
Oh,
no
wow.
screens on the main floor of the house. We spin records here all the time. I got a few hundred, and one of the first that I bought was Stankonia because I love that one front to back. If we're getting into hip hop, I think another one I was really torn. The one that I shared for anybody that's not aware was Yeezus. I love that album. It's like my
Yep.
favorite like hyped up album. But I was really torn between that and 36 Chambers. I know you said Fugees, so I'm guessing you probably like Wu-Tang, same
Sure.
sort of genre, time frame
Yeah,
there. That 36 Chambers album, I can listen to that one front to back every day.
you're right. And I don't know if it's cheating, but I could do the Nirvana Unplugged album from front to back the entire time.
Yeah. Got some
Man,
good
I
taste in
mean,
music though.
Man Who Saved the World. Let's go.
Hmm.
One
Yeah,
of I
that's a
think
good
one of
one
my
too.
favorite covers ever.
Yeah. Yeah, I was never big into live music. Like I like going to concerts, but I never listened to a lot of live music albums until recently. And it was actually about 6 years ago. I stumbled across this album, Bill Withers live at Carnegie Hall in 1972. And he's telling stories in between and he's engaging the
Right.
audience and he's introducing his band members. And it was the first time that I listened to a live album that really kind of clicked with me. And I've been checking out a lot of live music since then. So if you got any other good recommendations, the unplugged ones are obviously great, but if you got anything else, send them my way.
I do. I'll shoot them to you. Another good one is the Buena Vista Social Club. If you're not into them, it's Cuban music. It's
Ooh,
fantastic.
all right,
So
I'm writing that
I'll
down
shoot.
right now.
Yeah, yeah, definitely check it out. They were live, I think, at Carnegie Hall. They did a documentary on it. It was like when Cuba first allowed people back into the States, they came to do Carnegie Hall. And you can see like these 80-year-old Cuban guys looking at the Statue of Liberty and just crying between sets. I mean, it was incredible. So
That's awesome.
definitely check that out. All right, let's do a little football here. Dave, I'm dipping my toes into IDP this year. Explain to me why that's a good thing. Are you a fan of the IDP? Do you have some tips for me? Like, when do I start drafting defensive players?
So I am in a couple of IDP leagues, but what I've learned during my time in the industry is that I'm not in good IDP leagues. So I've talked to a lot of people, and really what you want to have, of talking to, I don't know if you've noticed, but at Football Guys, we hired a ton of IDP writers this year. So I
Mhm.
still am kind of nervous. I don't play in a ton of IDP leagues myself. And the IDP leagues I'm in would usually have one or two IDP slots. So you'd have your standard quarterback, two running backs, three wide receivers, flex, kicker, defense, and then you got one or two IDP spots down at the bottom. And when you're doing it like that, you almost value the IDP players the same you'd value a kicker or a defense. You wait until the final rounds, you draft one or two guys there. And really, because you're only having to fill up one or two spots in the entire league, there isn't a huge difference between the top guy and then the 10th guy who's playing on somebody else's roster. So what I've learned over the years, and I haven't done this yet, and I need to, I just have yet to find a good enough league mates to join a league. But from what I hear, the best IDP leagues are the ones where you have an equal amount of offensive skill players and IDP players. So if you've got a quarterback, two running backs, three wide receivers, and a tight end, you should have 7 IDP spots in that league
Okay.
to really maximize the IDP value. Because if you're just going to have 1, 2, or 3 slots, then you just wait till the very end and draft them, in the same spot that you're drafting your kickers. So that's what I need to get better at. And I'm starting to read and consume a lot of the content that we're putting out at Football Guys, but admittedly, I'm not in as many IDP leagues as I'd like to be.
Yeah, I asked Sig about that. He said that IDP seems to be moving faster as we go than a lot of the other ways of playing. I just started a league the other day. We're doing 5 IDP slots. So kind of just a way to, like I said, dipping our toes in the water to see how it works. The other big thing, Dave, that is kind of, gaining traction are these super flex leagues where, you're running 2 quarterbacks at a time. How do you manage that? Where do you start draft? Do you draft or your first 2 picks quarterbacks in a league like that? And I guess the secondary question is, at what point have you ever and would you ever trade up to the first overall spot in Dynasty? Does it make any sense to do that?
Yeah, so super flex leagues, I love super flex leagues, and I kind of scoffed at them like 4 or 5 years ago when they started gaining some popularity
Two
because
quarterbacks, what?
exactly, yeah, I didn't really understand it. I'm like, we're playing, we want it to look like an actual football team, and I thought it was kind of silly at first, but really, we've seen that there's usually like 10 pretty good quarterbacks, and you might see, Jalen Hurts last year, Patrick Mahomes last year, Josh Allen the year before. There's going to be one guy that's going to score above the rest, but like at the end of the day, between QB5, QB10, there isn't a huge difference. You see big breaks in scoring once you get outside of that top 10 and then even further outside of the top 12 and outside of the top 15. So I think when you play in these super flex drafts, it adds so much more strategy because when you're playing regular redraft, everyone wants to load up on their running backs and wide receivers early, sprinkle in a handful of the elite tight ends. And then pretty much everybody's waiting on quarterbacks because kind of like we were talking about with the IDP, if you're not having a bunch of IDP slots, you wait on the quarterbacks because if you're in a 12-team league, 12, maybe 15 quarterbacks are getting drafted. Everybody's getting a pretty good quarterback there. But if you're in a 12-team super flex league, things change dramatically because every single week, 24 quarterbacks are getting started. There's only 32 starting quarterbacks in the league, which means there's only a handful of teams that are going to even have a backup quarterback option. So then there's a lot more strategy involved. Do I need to pay up for one of these quarterbacks now to make sure I've got an elite option? I've seen other people take the really scary route of going no quarterback in a super flex draft. And it looks wild for people that have never seen super flex draft before because somebody in round 3 is sitting there with Justin Jefferson, Christian McCaffrey, and Saquon Barkley. And you're like, how in the world did you get all of these guys? Well, you got all the quarterbacks going at the early part of the draft. But I think the biggest mistake that people make when playing super draft is reaching for those middle tier quarterbacks. So it's really important. If you can lock in 2 stud quarterbacks, you're at a huge advantage over the rest of the league. If you were drafting a few years ago and you got Patrick Mahomes in the first round and then you bought that dip on Josh Allen when people were kind of concerned about his long-term output. And now if you're sitting on a dynasty league with Patrick Mahomes and Josh Allen, congratulations. You've got a 40-point advantage over your opponent every single week. But what happens is those guys do score the most. So in a typical super flex draft, you'll see right now the way that dynasty boards are shaking out. You're usually seeing 6 to 9 quarterbacks go off the board before any skill position players. So it's kind of crazy to wrap your mind around. You're like, why is Joe Burrow and Justin Herbert and Lamar Jackson and Justin Fields going ahead of Justin Jefferson? And it's just because of the replacement value of the other positions can be so hard. But then people fall into the trap where going into round 3, they don't have their quarterback. So they start reaching on Kirk Cousins and Daniel Jones and Matthew Stafford, the guys that realistically probably shouldn't be going that early. So you need to kind of draw a line when you're looking at your quarterback rankings. Where are the guys that could have an elite finish to the season? And those are the guys you want to reach for. But once you've missed that window, wherever you draw the line, if you think Deshaun Watson is the last guy on that tier, if you think it's Tua Tagovailoa, wherever you draw that line, that's when you got to stop reaching for quarterbacks. Because that's what I see new super flex drafters doing often is paying up in the 3rd round for a guy that realistically might only be starting for a year or two and probably isn't going to be better than a top 20 quarterback. So you want to get those super elite quarterbacks, but outside of that, it's okay to wait.
How many leagues are you in this year?
Dynasty, I am in 12 dynasty leagues. And then, I've only done a couple of redraft leagues so far, but I was in about a dozen redraft leagues last year. This year, probably up that a little bit. I don't know. It's tough to say. I'll probably be in about 30 by the time the season kicks off.
What do you think? Where do you think fantasy football is headed? You guys football guys are at the forefront of things. What do you think is next in the evolution of fantasy football? And after that, I guess the follow-up is there currently a rule that you hate?
Well, those are some good questions. And let me start with the first one. Where do I think fantasy football is headed? You talked about it. Sigmund Bloom was saying that IDP is starting to grow, and it certainly is. Dynasty is also starting to grow. Best ball is starting to grow. We're starting to see a little bit of a dip in DFS. I think that just got infested with sharks, and your casual player is losing money in DFS, so they don't want to play anymore. But I see IDP, Dynasty, and Best Ball are all growing exponentially. And I think, if you look back, 10 years ago, IDP leagues were extremely niche. Yeah, like they had an IDP setting on ESPN, but the majority of leagues weren't using it. And now I think people are trying to find different ways to play fantasy football. I'm completely with Sig that IDP is one of the fastest growing, but I think the future of fantasy football, what's really going to be like the most popular platform, is Best Ball. And I don't know if you play best ball, Doug.
I
I
do.
love best ball. Yeah, it's a blast. And I think we can all admit, anybody who plays fantasy football, the best part about playing fantasy football is the draft. Drafting is so much fun. You know, it's really fun is drafting 100 teams. You know, it's not fun is managing 100 teams and running waivers for 100 teams and trying to keep up with trades in your inboxes and all that. So best ball, I feel like, is perfect for kind of where we're at right now as a society. You know, people don't want to commit to something for 6 months, but they could easily sit down for 35, 45 minutes, draft a team, and then never look at it again. So me personally, last year I did over 500 best ball drafts. This year I'm probably going to do over 1,000 best ball drafts.
Right.
I have become obsessed with best ball, and a lot of my friends are starting to dip their toes in. Friends that are outside of the fantasy football industry, just casual fantasy football players, are now signing up on Underdog, and they're having a blast with it. So I think best ball is the future. Just because you don't have to do that season-long commitment, you can throw 100 darts in there, have 100 teams, and hope that one of them hits throughout the season.
I have never been a commissioner of a league. I never started the league, been in plenty of leagues. I know that I'm not even going down that route. I'm just saying that when I went on to Sleeper this time, they have an option for your league to do best ball setup. Do you think that is, I mean, that I almost did it that way. I probably should have checked with the other league members. I did not realize that like your home leagues are now best ball options. Do you
Yeah.
like it that way for in those kind of leagues, picking and choosing or best ball all the way, all the time?
Yeah, so I'm in a few of those, and again, you still have to deal with waivers. So even though it's best ball
Right.
scoring, you still have to run waivers. You can still make trades,
Mhm.
but you know how frustrating it is, Doug. You've played fantasy football for a long time. Is there anything worse than,
Yeah.
let's say, Christian McCaffrey, your first round pick, goes out, rolls his ankle in the first quarter, and you're looking at, 1.6 points from your RB1 slot. Meanwhile, some guy on your bench stumbles into the end zone 3 times and has 28 points, and there's nothing you can do about it. So that's the nice thing about best ball is that when you're just doing strictly best ball scoring, you still get to do the roster management stuff, but you don't have to worry about the flukiness. You're not getting hurt by injuries to your players. So I do see a potential for that could be the next big thing. What I do in my home league actually is we do I don't even know what we call it, but we allow for one switch. If a player gets hurt before the first half of the game, you're allowed to pull that player out of your lineup and substitute in for somebody on your bench. So that's a way that we've kind of tried to work around injuries because that is the worst part of the game. I mean, anybody who plays fantasy football knows how bad that sucks. So you're allowed one switch per week if your player gets hurt in the first half of the game. So it's kind of a modified best ball in a way.
Right.
But a lot of the guys that I am in industry leagues with, at the end of the day, I'm trying on Sunday mornings, I've got to update rankings. I'm doing a sit live show that I've got to
Right.
worry about. I
Right.
don't have time to make sure that I have the optimal lineup set in for every single one of mine. So I've got my dozen or so leagues that I pay attention to and set my lineups in. But a lot of the industry dynasty leagues that I'm in are best ball formats. So you don't have to worry about setting that lineup every week.
Is that a sleeper option to be able to make that one switch? To do that
Yeah.
manually. I didn't see that. I'm gonna have to
It,
go check
well,
that.
so it is
Great.
manual. You can do it in sleeper, but the commissioner has to manually go in and override that.
Okay. All right. So more work for me.
Exactly. And man, talk about it. I know you said you commissioned a job or a league now. It is the most thankless and stressful job. You don't get paid for it. Nobody
No.
ever thanks you for it. Like, I always like at the end of the season, I'm expecting my league mates to like send me an edible arrangement or some flowers or like, hey, Dave, thanks for the great job. But you never get so much as a pat on the back, man. It's thankless work.
Like I say, it's the first time I've done it, so I'll wait to complain like everybody else until the season is over and I've gotten my lashes. All right,
Godspeed. Wait until there's a trade that a handful of people in the league don't
don't
like.
like.
And then yeah, so I'd set those bylaws now, say, hey, try to get ahead of the problems before they start. So you just strictly say, hey, we don't veto anything, or we have try to set the rules ahead of time. If you're a first-time commissioner, that's what I'd say. Try to think of anything that could possibly happen and set a rule ahead of time so you're not dealing with an in-season headache.
That was when I asked Sig yesterday or Wednesday about a rule he'd changed. It was the trading. It was like, I'm assuming you're in a league with honest and reputable people. We shouldn't have to veto trades. Like if you're in with scoundrels, you should have like maybe not gotten in that league where you have to test every trade. So I thought that was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Dave, let me get to my list here. I've put together some players. We'll start out. I'll ask you. I looked up the ADP on football guys. I'm curious which ones you like. So, drafting Kelce at 5 or Pitts at 77.
That's a tough one. I think that you go Kelce here. I mean, I'm not ranking him as my 101, but if somebody has Kelce as the number 1 overall pick in their rankings, I can get behind it. I mean, I can make an argument for it. He gives you such an advantage at the position. So I love Kyle Pitts, and Kyle Pitts, it's in his range of outcomes that he could be the wide or the tight end 1 this year, but he also has a lot going against him. I mean, it is the perfect example of situation versus talent. And, Travis Kelce happens to have a great situation and a lot of talent. Kyle Pitts, you can argue, is actually a more talented player when you look at his rate metrics, his yards per route run, targets per route run, air yard share, all of that stuff. He is the best tight end in the league. It's kind of hard to argue against that. The issue is the Falcons threw the ball at a historically low rate. And I think people don't even realize how little the Falcons threw last year because of the Bears, who threw even less. So everyone sees the Falcons the second least amount of throws and just kind of shrugs their shoulders at it. But they were actually 9th lowest in pass attempts per game over the last 40 years. So it was kind of overshadowed by the Bears, really anemic offense. The Falcons were historically bad. We just don't think about it as much. So that's what he's got working against him. He's got Drake London, who is, siphoning a ton of valuable targets from him. Now we got Bijan Robinson in the backfield as well. So there's a few ways. I just wrote like a 2,000 word article on Travis Kelce. There are on Kyle Pitts. There's a few ways that he could pay off at his ADP, but it's either that Desmond Ridder is elite, and I'm talking like elite, like needs to be better than Ryan Tannehill was in his prime, because he needs to be so good that he forces Arthur Smith to change up his coaching tendencies in his scheme. That's probably not going to happen. The other way that this can happen is if somehow Arthur Smith gets canned midseason and they bring in another coach who can change up the scheme. Also probably not going to happen. The most realistic opportunity and path for Kyle Pitts to pay off at his ADP, though, is if Drake London gets injured. And we never want to hope for injuries, of course, but they are a part of the game. If Drake London goes down, then Kyle Pitts is the only man standing in this passing game. He'll have a chance to increase his slice of the pie even more than he already has. And we could realistically be looking at a 35-40% target share from Kyle Pitts, where he is just going nuts as the de facto wide receiver 1 on this team. And that's kind of what I'm struggling, because if you look at the rate metrics for Drake London and Kyle Pitts right now, they're very, very similar. Drake London is going 2 rounds ahead of Kyle Pitts. He's a wide receiver. So I think we've got that flip-flopped where Kyle Pitts should be going ahead of Drake London because they're going to put up similar statistics. Kyle Pitts has the tight end designation. So he does have a really high-end range of outcomes, but I'm still going with the sure thing, Travis Kelce. I'm riding that man into the sunset.
I can't even begin to think how many championships I've won strictly because of Travis Kelce. So I'm totally with you there. All right, let's see. The next one I have here is Calvin Ridley at 46 or Deebo Samuels at 39.
I've got Deebo Samuel pegged as my biggest bust of the year this year. And it is tough for me to say because I love Deebo Samuel. Just purely as a fan of the game, Deebo Samuel is one of my favorite players in the league, no doubt. I kind of made a name for myself in the industry going into the 2021 season. I had Deebo Samuel ranked higher than every single expert on Fantasy Pros. I was pounding the table for Deebo Samuel, but I'd be lying if I said that I thought he was going to have 21 points per game and do what he did in 2021. He even smashed my expectations. And now I think ever since then, people are trying to recapture that magic that we saw in 2021. And the reality is we're probably not going to see it. 2019, 2020, and 2022, we saw Deebo Samuel was a wide receiver 3 in fantasy scoring. And then 2021, we had this weird situation where the team traded up for Trey Sermon and he ended up kind of being a bust. And then they plugged Elijah Mitchell in and he couldn't stay healthy. And then Jeff Wilson Jr. got hurt. And then Deebo Samuel got shoehorned into this Deebo role that we're still talking about years later that realistically doesn't exist. We saw it for half a season where he was getting goal line work, and that's what was able to raise his ceiling. But now Christian McCaffrey is there, and Christian McCaffrey is playing the Deebo role. So now Deebo is the wide receiver 2. He's going to have games where he's getting out-targeted by Brandon Ayuk, George Kittle, and Christian McCaffrey. I hate to throw around the term too many mouths to feed, but the reality is that there are too many mouths to feed in San Francisco. Anyone paying up right now for Deebo at his ADP is trying to recapture magic that we saw in 2021 that we probably aren't going to see again.
You mentioned Trey Sermon, and just in passing, I was stunned that he wasn't any better than he was Like I really thought they had hit on something. Ohio State, right? Like I really thought
Yeah.
that was going to be a good player for them. I'm not sure what happened, but he had
Philly
all
brought
the
him in last
makings.
year too. Philly brought him in, and he never
Right.
made it off the practice squad. I'm not really sure. That's just you see players bust, and that's all you can chalk Trey Sermon up. Just a bust. It happens.
You brought up Philly. We'll use that as a segue here. Swift at 54 or Antonio Gibson at 111?
I mean, I obviously prefer Swift, and so do drafters. That's why he's going pretty far ahead. But man, if we're taking the ADP into account, I'm going to take Antonio Gibson here. I think Antonio Gibson right now, who's actually getting drafted, I mean, very, very closely, but he's getting drafted behind Brian Robinson. In a vacuum, I prefer Antonio Gibson to Brian Robinson. I don't know why Robinson got the touches he did last year. I think that he is, Ron Rivera really likes that type of bruising between the tackles type of guy. But on an efficiency basis, I mean, I don't know why Antonio Gibson isn't getting more touches because when this guy gets the ball in his hands, he is a spark plug. And maybe I'm just getting duped again by the fancy metrics and the coach speak in the offseason, but they're saying they want to get Antonio Gibson more involved. And maybe I'm the fool for sipping the Kool-Aid again, but I got to think that after we saw these flashes from him last year, flashes the year before, maybe this is the year that they finally give him a bigger workload. So I'm going to take, especially considering ADP, I'll take Antonio Gibson.
Last year on the Chiefs, I've said this repeatedly on the podcast because I think it's worth noting. Jerick McKinnon was second on the Chiefs last year in receiving touchdowns with 9.
Mm-hmm.
If that's the role, that's what they're looking at with Gibson this year, which I don't see why they wouldn't be. Brian Robinson is kind of the Pacheco role, and then Gibson could be the year that he finally gets used the way Commanders fans have been hoping they'd use him since he got drafted. So I think that is an interesting one, and I'm glad I didn't dump off all my Gibson stock last year.
Now, the one thing that gives me slightly cold feet with Antonio Gibson are the rumors about Kareem Hunt. Eric Bieniemy is the one that was there Kareem Hunt's rookie season in Kansas City and got the best out of him. And to be frank, I think Kareem Hunt is washed. I mean, he looked terrible last year, and his efficiency metrics tell me what I saw on film as well. He just did not look good last year. So a lot of times we see coaches, they make decisions with their gut. And, Eric Bieniemy might think that Kareem Hunt is the guy that he was 5 years ago. He probably isn't, but that would be detrimental to Antonio Gibson's role because Kareem Hunt would come in and take a lot of that passing down work.
We always wrap these things up with rookie versus the vet. My old podcasting partner used to put those together, Nate Coleman. He is in Djibouti, Africa right now, serving. So I will attempt to put the rookie versus the vet together in his stead. Let's do Nick Chubb at 19 or Jahmyr Gibbs at 35.
Oh, give me Gibbs. I love this dude so much, man. He was so fun to watch in college, and he just profiles to just be a beast in the passing game, and that's where you get your points. I mean, we saw last year, Jared Goff had some big money throws, which frankly I was pretty surprised by. But outside of those big shots that he did take, they ran a pretty conservative offense. The passing game that was funneled through Amon-Ra St. Brown was at or near the line of scrimmage, and then they focused a ton on the run. And I'm a Bears fan. I've seen David Montgomery up close for his entire career. I don't think David Montgomery is as good as the public believes him to be. And looking at the contract that the Detroit gave him, I don't know if he's as good as Detroit thinks that he is either. I mean, he's one of those guys that does everything kind of well, but isn't exceptional at anything, which is kind of similar to what we saw from Jamal Williams last year. I mean, Jamal Williams isn't great at anything, but he's a good do-it-all type of guy. I mean, it's looking at the two players. It's very, or the four players, I should say, the two backfields. David Montgomery and Jamal Williams are very similar players. And then DeAndre Swift and Jahmyr Gibbs are very similar players.
Right.
I think the difference is Jahmyr Gibbs isn't afraid to finish runs where DeAndre Swift kind of dances around the contact a little bit. So, Dan Campbell, biting kneecaps, getting players pumped up. He wants to see somebody that's going to finish a run, and Jahmyr Gibbs does that. So hopefully we can see Jahmyr Gibbs get that role that we hoped DeAndre Swift would get throughout all the years because he is such a good player. So I like Nick Chubb, but just his limitations in the passing game, getting up there in age a little bit. Jerome Ford is projected to take a little bit more of the passing work. So I'm going to go with Gibbs, especially at cost.
Pacheco at 67 or Charbonnet at 91?
I'm going Pacheco here. And okay. I think a lot of people have this idea, maybe a misconception that Pacheco was going to do nothing except grind in between the 20s on early down work. And it makes sense. Jerick McKinnon took a ton of passing down work last year. He's a fantastic pass blocker. He's great as an outlet in the red zone. But as the season went on, you got to remember, Pacheco was a seventh round guy. Seventh round rookies don't normally see the field at all. And this guy was getting significant work throughout the playoffs and in the Super Bowl. And that's when these games were important. I mean, we're talking playoff must-win games. Pacheco started to see his role grow in the passing game. And I think that's something, so many people fixate on regular season numbers because you don't get a full sample in the postseason. Well, we saw the Chiefs make a run in the postseason, and every single one of those games, Pacheco saw his targets going up. He saw his increased role in the passing game. So I think Pacheco is one of the best values out there in drafts right now because everybody thinks, he's going to get the low value touches in between the 20s. Then he's going to get yanked off the field for Jerick McKinnon to come in on third down and come in on the goal line. But I think Pacheco is kind of a dark horse to steal some of that goal line and some of the passing down work. And really, he has a ceiling that I think a lot of people aren't really talking about.
Trevor Lawrence at 63 or Anthony Richardson at 99?
I'm going to go with Trevor Lawrence here. Trevor Lawrence looked amazing last year. And I kind of look at last year as his rookie year.
Right.
I'm okay taking 2021 and just throwing it out the window. What Urban Meyer was doing there in Jacksonville, I don't want to read too deeply into it. Last year was the first time that he had some stability from his coaching staff, and he looked fantastic. I mean, down the stretch, he was surgical, hitting every single level of the field. He's got the legs to extend plays if he needs to. And I think people have gotten a little over their skis with Anthony Richardson. And we see this often now. A few years back, these young, athletic, mobile quarterbacks were always super cheap in drafts, and they were the league winners. I'm talking about Kyler Murray, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes' rookie season, Lamar Jackson in 2019. You can get these guys at the very end of your draft. But then after we saw all of those guys break out, now we're starting to see those guys creep up boards to the point that the downside isn't really baked into their ADP. I mean, look at last year. Trey Lance was a 6th round pick because everybody saw young, big arm, fast legs, and they just didn't even think that there could be a modicum of downside, despite the fact that all the indications out of San Francisco were that they were keeping Jimmy Garoppolo around and that he might still have a role. And sure, it was an injury, but even in the 2 games he played, Lance didn't look great. So when you look at Indianapolis, I think people just assume that Anthony Richardson is going to be the week 1 starter and that he's going to rush for 1,000 yards and he's going to be an elite fantasy quarterback. And while it's certainly possible, the other possibility is that he does what a lot of rookies do and he struggles and he gets benched, and they've got a capable backup in Gardner Minshew that they can plug in. So people are just completely ignoring the possibility that Anthony Richardson could get benched this year. And they're so blinded by the upside that they're just failing to recognize the downside. So give me Trevor Lawrence, who we know is basically locked and loaded for a QB1 finish.
Last one here. My main man, George Pickens at 72 or Zay Flowers at 109?
Oh, I'm sorry you said your main man because I think I'm going to let you down here.
Well, I'm a Georgia guy, so he's got to be.
All right. Fair enough. I love Zay Flowers, man. I love Zay Flowers so much. And then I think that the addition of Todd Monk in there in Baltimore is really going to open this offense up. And, everybody thinks, I'm so sick of the Lamar Jackson as a running back fan or a running back, talking point. I'm sure you can see over my shoulder right here. That is a Lamar Jackson jersey. Big fan of the guy. And I think that he is so underrated as a passer. And I mean, you can obviously look back at 2019 where his numbers were really inflated. I mean, that was one of the best passing seasons on an efficiency basis that we have ever seen. So I think they can uncork him a little bit as a passer this year in this Todd Monken offense. So big fan of Zay Flowers. And Pickens, I like him, man. He reminds, it's kind of like Deebo Samuel. Like watching him play, I love the player. I'm just not sure if he's going to get a big enough workload to pay off of that ADP. Yeah. But man, the things that he does, like throwing a cornerback flat on his back off press coverage, that stuff is fun. And I like that, but unfortunately, you don't get points for that in fantasy football.
Well, and to your point about Zay Flowers, I mean, have they had anybody else outside of Mark Andrews stay healthy enough, long enough for you to be comfortable? And I mean, it's been Rashad Bateman's season ever since he got in the league, right? And he's just never stayed healthy enough to do it. Zay Flowers is going to get a lot of work in that slot. And I really think just nationally, I have been surprised that there has not been more discussion about the Monken effect in Baltimore. I mean, look at what he did for Stetson Bennett in that offense. Now, I'm not saying they didn't have weapons on that Georgia offense. Obviously, they did, including some really good tight ends, which Baltimore has. So I've got really excited to see what Monken can do with that group. He doesn't mind a running quarterback. I think you're going to see a lot more passing, though, from Lamar Jackson this year, without a doubt.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. I've already got a little bit of money down on Lamar Jackson winning the 2023 MVP. I think if we can
Okay.
still see him run the way that we've seen in years past, and now he's reinvigorated with this big contract, and we get to see him get unleashed a little bit as a pass catcher or as a passer with Rashad Bateman, Mark Andrews, Zay Flowers, and then they're talking about J.K. Dobbins finally catching the ball a bit more out of the backfield, which we saw glimpses of in college, but haven't seen so far in the NFL. This could be a really, really fun Ravens offense.
Yeah, they certainly don't mind throwing to the backs in that Monken offense.
Yep.
Chuck, we finish up all these shows now. What advice would you give to up and comers, people just getting started in kind of the fantasy space? What would you suggest to them? What kind of advice can you give to them?
I'm always apprehensive to try to give advice in situations like this because I feel like I was so lucky and so blessed. You know, so much of my success has come from being in the right place at the right time and connecting with the right people. And I realize that everybody has a different journey and a different story. But the one thing that I found consistent with anybody who has found success in this industry is just working hard and being kind. And that Scott Fish talks about all the time. I mean, it's the banner on his Twitter if you go to it. Be kind, be a good person, the rest will fall into place. And I think that's what it comes down to. And, you know, some people are going to get breaks earlier than others, and some people will get a little bit more luck on their side. But luck is when opportunity and, you know, when what's the saying? Luck is when opportunity and preparation meet. And that's really what it is. You know, you put in the reps, you connect with people, you work on your craft at being a better fantasy football analyst. And then when that opportunity does arise, hopefully you're in a position where you can crush it. And the best way to have those opportunities come your way is just to work hard and be a good person.
Dave, thank you, man. I appreciate it. This was a blast. Always enjoy having you on, and we won't wait as long next time. It felt like it was too long between last time we saw you. So thank you, buddy. I always appreciate your time.
Thanks, Doug. Appreciate it, man.
All right, bud.